The year was 1976, and Harrison Ford was on his knees in George Lucas's office, fixing a door that wouldn't close properly. The smell of sawdust filled the air as his hammer struck wood in steady, practiced rhythms. He wasn't there to audition. He wasn't there to pitch himself. He was there because a door was broken, and fixing broken things was what he did. Ford had sworn off acting 3 years earlier after a decade of humiliating rejections, bit parts that led nowhere, and studio executives who told him he'd never make it. He'd found peace in carpentry, honest work, predictable income, a way to feed his family without begging for roles he'd never get. But as he tightened the hinges on that door, he had no idea that George Lucas was watching him with an intensity that had nothing to do with woodworking. In less than 10 minutes, Lucas would offer him a role that Ford would initially refuse. That refusal, that door, and the conversation that followed would accidentally create Han Solo, launch the biggest film franchise in history, and transform a Carpenter who hated Hollywood into the most reluctant superstar the world had ever seen. If you want to discover the untold stories behind Hollywood's biggest legends, subscribe to our channel and join us on this journey through cinema history. By 1976, Harrison Ford's hands told his story. Calloused palms, sawdust under his fingernails, the ache from hours of planing hardwood. He'd taught himself carpentry from library books after Hollywood rejected him. Columbia Pictures had dropped him in 1966, telling him he'd never succeed. That rejection liberated him. He learned through trial and error, and by 1976 was charging $40 an hour, enough to support his wife and 2 sons. Carpentry gave him what acting never had: respect earned through competence. A cabinet either fit perfectly or it didn't. There was an honesty to it that felt cleansing after years of meaningless rejections. George Lucas called Ford in early 1976. Lucas was casting a science fiction film and needed someone to read lines with young actors. Lucas also mentioned a door that wasn't closing properly. Would Ford fix it? The job paid $75. Ford showed up with his toolbox. What Ford didn't know was Lucas had struggled to cast Han Solo for months. Lucas needed someone authentic who could deliver sarcastic dialogue naturally. Ford read Han Solo's lines with increasing impatience, his tone making clear this was a favor, not an audition. Between readings, he worked on the door. When Lucas asked him to read a scene with Mark Hamill, Ford put down his plane, wiped off sawdust, and read without performing. He just said the lines with boredom and irritation, and Lucas saw it immediately. This wasn't an actor playing Han Solo. This was Han Solo completely unforced, completely authentic. But when Lucas offered Ford the role, Ford said no. He'd moved on from acting. He had steady income. He wasn't throwing away stability for another role that might not amount to anything. Lucas tried explaining this was a major role in a significant film. Ford listened, skeptical. He was 33, too old to start over, too established in carpentry to risk it. He finished the door, collected his $75, and left with no intention of accepting. Lucas kept calling, pushing Ford to reconsider. He showed Ford concept art, alien worlds, massive starships, and a scrappy smuggler who resembled Ford. Lucas explained Han Solo was a pilot who'd been let down by causes and decided to look out for himself. Cynical but not heartless, he was exactly who Ford was at that moment, someone burned by a system that promised more than it delivered. Ford began to waver, not because he believed Star Wars would succeed, but because something about Han Solo appealed to him. The character was flawed, mercenary, emotionally guarded. Ford understood that, and Lucas was offering real money, financial security even if the film flopped. There was another factor, fear of wondering what might have been. If he walked away now, he'd be closing the door on those rare moments when acting had felt meaningful. So he called Lucas and said yes, making it clear this was one time only. He'd do the film, collect his paycheck, return to carpentry. Lucas agreed, though he suspected Ford's Carpenter identity would become impossible to maintain once Star Wars released. Filming Star Wars in 1976 was surreal. The sets looked fake, the dialogue was clunky, his young co-stars inexperienced. Mark Hamill was 24, Carrie was 19. None of them thought it would succeed, but Ford approached the work professionally. He struggled with the physical demands, running, jumping, fighting. He injured his ankle early on, but the real challenge was making Han Solo feel real despite ludicrous circumstances. Ford discovered his Carpenter identity helped. He played Han Solo as a working-class guy, a mechanic who trusted his skills more than mystical forces. Ford drew on his craftsman experience, his skepticism about Hollywood, his preference for concrete solutions. He played the character as a blue-collar worker unimpressed by the space opera around him. That interpretation made Han Solo work. He became the audience surrogate voicing doubts viewers were thinking. Production wrapped in July 1976. Ford returned to Los Angeles and went back to carpentry. But something had happened during the Tunisia shoot. Ford had begun an affair with Carrie Fisher, his 19-year-old co-star. The relationship was brief, intense, and deeply inappropriate. Ford was married, more than a decade older, her superior in the hierarchy. It ended after production, but the guilt stayed with Ford. He'd violated his principles, betrayed his wife, taken advantage of a young woman. The affair would remain secret for decades, only becoming public in 2016 when Fisher published her memoir. But in 1976, the secret added another layer of complication to his conflicted feelings about Hollywood. Star Wars premiered May 25, 1977, in fewer than 40 theaters. Ford attended a screening in Westwood with his family. What happened altered his life. The audience loved it. They cheered, laughed, gasped, and they responded to Han Solo with enthusiasm that caught Ford off guard. Every sarcastic line, every cynical aside, audiences ate it up. Han Solo was the breakout character. Within days, lines formed outside theaters. Star Wars became a phenomenon, changing American cinema, and Harrison Ford, the reluctant Carpenter, suddenly found himself famous. The transformation happened too quickly. He couldn't go to the hardware store without being recognized, couldn't work on carpentry jobs without clients asking about Star Wars. Lucas called. Star Wars had become the highest-grossing film ever, and they were making sequels. Ford's contract obligated him to appear. The Carpenter's life was evaporating. And the worst part was he'd been right to be skeptical. He'd spent a decade trying to become an actor, and failed. Then he'd given up, become a carpenter, and accidentally stumbled into the biggest role of a generation because he was fixing a door in the right office. The randomness was infuriating. But something else was happening. He'd enjoyed playing Han Solo. Not the fame, but the actual work of inhabiting the character. Acting engaged something deeper than carpentry. It required vulnerability, emotional honesty. His natural personality avoided. Playing Han Solo had forced him to drop his armor temporarily, and it felt both terrifying and liberating. So when Lucas called about the sequel, Ford said yes. Not just because his contract required it, but because part of him wanted to see where this accidental career might lead. Empire Strikes Back began filming in 1979. Ford understood Han Solo now, how to balance selfishness with buried nobility. He pushed back against clunky dialogue, even advocated for Han Solo to die, arguing it would give dramatic weight. Lucas refused, but Ford's suggestion revealed he cared about the character and story. Carpentry work had fallen away. Between Star Wars sequels and other film offers, Ford's schedule was consumed. Steven Spielberg began talking about an adventure film set in the 1930s, featuring an archaeology professor who moonlighted as a treasure hunter. That became Raiders of the Lost Ark. Spielberg had wanted Tom Selleck, but Selleck was committed to Magnum P.I. Lucas suggested Ford. After meeting Ford, Spielberg was convinced. Ford brought the same working-class authenticity to Indiana Jones, playing him as a blue-collar professor more comfortable in a leather jacket than a tweed suit. Raiders premiered in 1981, grossing over $300 million. Suddenly Ford wasn't just Han Solo, he was Indiana Jones too. Fame made the post-Star Wars attention seem mild. Paparazzi followed everywhere. His privacy was gone. Ford retreated inward, doing obligatory interviews but making clear he had no interest in being a celebrity. He was an actor. That was the job. His marriage to Mary Marquardt, strained since the Fisher affair, ended in divorce in 1979. He married screenwriter Melissa Matheson in 1983. The relationship grounded him, but the balance was fragile. The 1980s should have been Ford's golden decade. He starred in the biggest films of the era. He returned as Han Solo for Return of the Jedi in 1983. He played Indiana Jones in 2 more films. He took on other roles including Blade Runner in 1982 and Witness in 1985, which earned Ford his only Academy Award nomination. The Oscar nomination validated something he'd suspected, that he was capable of more than action roles, that he had depth and range. But the validation came at a cost. The more successful Ford became, the more his personal life suffered. His marriage to Melissa Matheson began showing cracks under pressure of his constant work schedule and emotional unavailability. Ford had always been closed off, reluctant to show vulnerability. That reticence had served him well as a carpenter. But in a marriage, that same quality became isolating. There were darker complications too. The Carrie Fisher affair, though long over, continued to haunt him. Fisher had moved on, become successful as both actor and writer, but the secret they shared sat between them at Star Wars events. Ford dealt with it the way he dealt with most uncomfortable emotions, by not dealing with it, by compartmentalizing, by focusing on work. Meanwhile, Ford threw himself into work with increasing intensity. He developed a reputation as a demanding actor, someone who challenged directors, rewrote dialogue, insisted on doing his own stunts. Some of that came from genuine commitment to craft, but some came from something darker, a self-destructive impulse Ford didn't fully understand. The most dramatic expression came through Ford's passion for aviation. He'd learned to fly in the 1960s. By the 1990s, he owned multiple aircraft and flew regularly. But flying wasn't just a hobby, it was escape, a way of being completely alone, completely in control. In the air, Ford wasn't a movie star, he was just a pilot. There was a purity to it. But flying was also dangerous, especially the way Ford did it. He pushed boundaries, flew in marginal weather, took risks. In March 2000, Ford's risk-taking caught up with him. He was piloting his helicopter in Santa Clarita, practicing maneuvers with a flight instructor, when the aircraft experienced sudden power loss. Ford reacted quickly, aimed for an empty field, and managed a controlled crash landing. Both walked away with minor injuries, but the incident was a wake-up call. Ford was 57, still living as if he were invincible. But the helicopter crash reminded him he wasn't. The 2000s brought changes Ford couldn't control. His marriage to Melissa Matheson ended in 2004, a divorce that cost him tens of millions but which Ford accepted as the price of his emotional failings. He'd never been a good husband, never been fully present in relationships, never allowed himself to be truly vulnerable. He knew that about himself, but knowing didn't change it. He was fundamentally solitary, more comfortable with tools than with human intimacy. He began a relationship with Callista Flockhart in 2002. Flockhart was nearly 25 years younger, but the relationship seemed to work. Flockhart had her own successful career, didn't need Ford to define her identity, and seemed to accept his limitations. They married in 2010, and the marriage has been stable. But personal stability couldn't protect Ford from the reckoning around his past. In 2016, Carrie Fisher published The Princess Diarist, a memoir based on journals from Star Wars filming. In the book, Fisher revealed the affair, describing it in painful detail, the power imbalance, her youth and naivety, Ford's unavailability, the way the relationship had damaged her and left scars that took decades to heal. The revelation was explosive, dominating entertainment news. Ford was forced to address it publicly. In interviews, he confirmed the affair had happened, but his comments were terse. He described the relationship as awkward, said it had been a mistake, offered a half apology that acknowledged wrongdoing without fully taking responsibility. The response was very Harrison Ford, honest in basic facts, evasive in emotional content, but the damage was done. The affair had always been Ford's secret shame, the thing that contradicted his image as a grounded working-class guy who'd stumbled into fame. It revealed him as someone who'd taken advantage of his position, betrayed his wife, hurt a young woman. It was a stain on his legacy. Tragically, Fisher died just months after her book was published, suffering cardiac arrest on a flight in December 2016. She was 60, still vibrant. Her death hit Ford hard. Whatever had happened between them, Fisher had been his friend, his co-star, an essential part of the mythology that had defined his career. And now she was gone, and Ford would never have the chance to make things right, to have the honest conversation they'd never had. Harrison Ford is 83 now, in 2025, and he's still working. He returned to Indiana Jones one final time in 2023 for Dial of Destiny, a film that served as both conclusion to the character's story and meditation on aging and legacy. The film received mixed reviews, but Ford's performance was universally praised. He brought gravitas and melancholy to the role, playing Indiana Jones as a man haunted by his past, struggling to find purpose in a world that had moved on. It was Harrison Ford playing himself, the aging action hero trying to figure out what comes next, and what does come next. He's given interviews saying he's done with big action franchises. He wants smaller roles, character parts, films that don't require him to run and jump. He wants more time with his family, more time flying his planes, more time in his workshop. Because despite everything, despite the fame, despite 5 decades as one of Hollywood's biggest stars, Harrison Ford still has a workshop, still builds furniture, still finds satisfaction in the smell of sawdust and the feel of wood grain under his hands. The Carpenter identity he created in the 1970s as an escape from Hollywood rejection has become in his 80s a refuge from Hollywood success. It's the place where he can be himself, not Han Solo or Indiana Jones or Harrison Ford the movie star, but just a guy working with his hands, solving concrete problems, creating something useful and beautiful. The Beverly Hills home where Ford lives with Callista Flockhart is filled with furniture he's built: dining room tables, cabinets, bookcases. These pieces aren't just functional. They're exquisite, built with craftsmanship that reflects the same commitment to excellence Ford brought to his acting. Museum-quality joinery, perfect proportions, wood chosen and finished with an artist's eye. Friends who visited describe it as a revelation. Here's a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars, who starred in some of the highest-grossing films of all time, who's been nominated for an Academy Award, and he spends his free time in his workshop, building furniture that will outlast him, that will be used by his family long after he's gone. That's the thing about carpentry. Ford has always understood, and Hollywood never could. The work endures. A well-built table lasts for generations. A properly constructed cabinet serves its purpose for 100 years. The films fade, the fame evaporates, the acclaim means less each passing year. But the things you make with your hands, the objects you craft with care and skill and patience, those things remain. They're your real legacy, more permanent than anything you could achieve on screen. And maybe that's why Ford never fully let go of his Carpenter identity, even when it became clear he was one of the most successful actors of his generation. The carpentry wasn't just a job or a hobby. It was proof he could create something real, something tangible, something that had value independent of his famous face or iconic roles. The door Harrison Ford fixed in George Lucas's office in 1976 has become Hollywood mythology. People ask about it constantly. Was it real? Did it really happen that way? Ford's answer has been consistent. The broad strokes are accurate. He was there to do carpentry work. He helped with auditions as a favor. Lucas saw something that led to the Han Solo casting. But Ford pushes back against the romantic version, the idea it was fate or destiny. It was just luck. Random, arbitrary luck. He happened to be in the right place at the right time, happened to have the right attitude for what Lucas was looking for, happened to say yes when he could have said no. And that randomness still bothers him. Ford built his Carpenter identity on the idea that success should come from skill and hard work, but his acting career violated that principle at every turn. He wasn't a trained actor. He wasn't particularly talented or charismatic or any of the things that should have made him a star. He just happened to be fixing a door when George Lucas needed a Han Solo. Everything that came after, the fame, the fortune, the iconic roles, was built on that foundation of pure chance. And while Ford has made peace with it, he's never fully accepted it. There's still a part of him that feels like an imposter, like someone who snuck into the party without an invitation. But here's what Ford has learned after 50 years in Hollywood, after playing Han Solo and Indiana Jones and countless other characters. Maybe carpentry and acting aren't as different as he always thought. Both require skill and patience and attention to detail. Both involve taking raw materials, wood or dialogue, tools or emotions, and shaping them into something that serves a purpose. Both demand you show up, do the work, and accept that the outcome isn't entirely in your control. A piece of furniture can warp, no matter how carefully you build it. A film can flop, no matter how good your performance. You do your best with what you're given, and then you let it go. That's the lesson Ford has been learning, slowly and reluctantly, for 5 decades. And it's the lesson he's trying to embody now, in the final act of his life and career. He still works, still takes acting roles, still shows up on set with professional competence. But he's no longer fighting against his success, no longer insisting he's just a carpenter who accidentally became a movie star. He's Harrison Ford, actor and craftsman, someone who spent a lifetime moving between 2 worlds and has finally realized those worlds were never as separate as he wanted them to be. The door he fixed in George Lucas's office didn't just open onto Han Solo and Star Wars and Hollywood fame. It opened onto a more complete version of himself, one that could hold both identities simultaneously, the carpenter and the actor, the craftsman and the star, the guy with the hammer and the guy with the blaster. If you ask Ford now in 2025 whether he has any regrets about walking through that door, about saying yes to George Lucas and taking on the role that changed his life, the answer is complicated. He regrets the affair with Carrie Fisher, regrets hurting his wife, regrets the damage from his weakness and poor judgment. He regrets the divorces, the time he didn't spend with his children, the relationships he damaged through his emotional unavailability. He regrets the ways fame invaded his privacy, made normal life impossible, turned him into a commodity rather than a person. But the work itself, The characters he played, the stories he helped tell, the entertainment he brought to hundreds of millions of people, those things he doesn't regret. Because in the end, carpentry and acting are both about making something that lasts. A well-built table, a memorable performance, a character that lives in the imagination of multiple generations. Harrison Ford has made both. He's built furniture that will serve his family for decades, and he's built characters, Han Solo, Indiana Jones, Rick Deckard, that will live forever in the collective memory of cinema. That door in George Lucas's office is long gone, probably replaced multiple times, but what it opened onto remains, and that, more than the fame or the fortune or the accolades, is Harrison Ford's real legacy. The door that never closed, the opportunity that never stopped giving, the accidental career that became an intentional life. He walked through that door reluctantly, skeptically, certain that acting would never be more than a temporary detour on his way back to carpentry. But the detour became the journey, and the journey, despite everything, despite all the complications and contradictions and regrets, turned out to be worth taking.